Okay, welcome everybody. Today I want to talk about the simulation hypothesis. I want to ask the question whether we live in a simulation, which is a pretty popular topic since the Matrix. And recently Elon Musk also said, well, there's maybe an 80% possibility that we live in a simulation. And I want to ask, what does that mean? And in order to analyze that, I really want to look at the person who actually came up with kind of scientific argumentation to present the simulation hypothesis in a more rigorous way. And we want to know what that means. And we will also look at a criticism from another scientist. She is a German scientist of quantum physics, and she says that's all pseudoscience, and we don't want to do that. We like these nerds, but come on, leave the nerds to be nerds. And the reason for why I do that is I actually kind of agree with her that I don't think the simulation hypothesis is wrong and doesn't have logic on their side, as she claims. But I think there's an more interesting idea what the simulation really is about. And I think there is a more interesting way of how we should talk about the simulation. And that is, we should talk about it in terms of Baudrillard. Baudrillard had a much different vision of what the simulation means, but we will talk later about that. So therefore, right now, let's focus on what Nick Bostrom has to say, and let's reconstruct what his argument actually really says.
Well, there is this article that I published back in 2003 presenting the simulation argument. This is an argument that tries to show that at least one of three propositions is true, although it doesn't tell us which of these three. The three propositions in question is first.
Okay, so just to summarize again, because we really want to understand it, he says, okay, there are three possibilities, and one of these three possibilities has to be true. And we really have to keep in mind what these three possibilities are. And he does not say we live in a simulation. He just says it's plausible that we live in a simulation. And I think in another article, I believe he has also given a concrete probability and gave that certain probability factors. Each
That
hypothesis.
almost all civilizations at our stage of technological development go extinct before they reach technological maturity. So that's the first possibility.
So, okay, let's look at the first possibility, and I really want to make that a bit exact here. So I looked up on Wikipedia, but that's a little bit better than other people look at that and misconstruct the arguments, right? So what is Bostrom's argument? Okay, we have first that there is no possibility that human civilizations reach a post-human stage where they can basically build simulations. So he says, okay, the hypothesis that we can do that is zero. We can assume that, right? We say, oh, we can never simulate the universe. That's very difficult. So that's the first hypothesis. Let's look at the second one.
A second possibility is that there is a very strong convergence among all technologically mature civilizations, in that they all lose interest in creating ancestor simulations, as I call them. These would be very detailed computer simulations of people like their historical forebears, detailed enough that the simulated people in the simulations would be conscious.
So this is the second hypothesis. Let's summarize it again, as it is here on Wikipedia, okay? So, oh wait, is that the second? That was still the first, right? That was still the first, yeah. So they can create detailed, well, the second hypothesis is that the civilizations just have no interest in doing that, because why should we be interested in creating simulations? So it's close to zero. Now, if we don't believe that the first and the second hypotheses are true, namely that we will be able, so we believe we reject first, that means we can be able at some point to create simulations of us, and second, we reject the second hypothesis and say, well, we are also interested in doing that. Then we come to the third hypothesis.
So the second possibility is that they just lose interest in doing this.
Mm.
And the third possibility is that we are almost certainly living in a simulation. So there's this argument.
So these are the three possibilities, right? The third possibility is, well, if we can reach it and we have interest in that, then we certainly live in a simulation. Now, why do we live in a simulation? That's a bit of a jump here. I think what he assumes is that there are probably something like multiple universes, and there's a large amount of people who actually live, while we are a small fraction of that. And the probability that if people run simulations and also have an interest in simulations, that we are then the people who are not yet integrated in a simulation is just very small. It's just very small because there will be so many people who run such a simulation. I believe that's kind of the argument. So at no point he says that we do live in a simulation. That's important here, right? So now let's listen to Sabine Hossenfelder, I believe. Yeah, Sabine Hossenfelder. What is her problem with this hypothesis?
That's my issue with the simulation hypothesis. Those who believe it make, maybe unknowingly, really big assumptions about what natural laws can be reproduced with computer simulations. And they don't explain how this is supposed to work.
Great effect, right? So her major argument is that people who argue for the simulation hypothesis, I guess like Nick Bostrom, they believe in magic. And let's have some effects in the background because we live now in the metaverse.
But finding alternative explanations that match all our observations to high precision is really difficult. The simulation hypothesis, therefore, just isn't a serious scientific argument.
So the simulation, to quote her, hypothesis, I have to make fun of that, I'm sorry. It's not a serious science, that what she's claiming, right? So it's pseudoscience.
This doesn't mean it's wrong, but it means you'd have to believe it because you have faith, not because you have logic on your side.
So, and I'm a bit triggered by that. That's why I'm also saying hypothesis, right? Because there are always physicists who come out of the woodwork and say something about philosophers like, well, obviously they don't have logic on their side. And I mean, like, philosophers also do logic, right? And there are many logical systems. And I really don't see what is logically wrong about Nick Bostrom's argument, because these are three possibilities, and then he tries to assign probability values here to it. And the only thing that she says is, well, I believe it's very difficult to run a simulation because to imitate or to create such exact laws of physics is not possible. Running consciousness on a computer is also not possible. So she actually says she believes in hypothesis 1. We won't be easily able to run such a simulation, which is in a sense a speculation about the future. And her argument for that is it's very difficult. She does not consider that there are future generations, that there are leaps in technology and so on. She just says at the current level of our civilization, we won't be able to run such a simulation. I don't see why that should be pseudoscience, therefore, or why it is not logic on their side, right? Nobody here says we believe, and nobody mixes religion into that soup. Right, that's another thing, that as soon as somebody meditates about the possibility of God, for example, would that be pseudoscience? That's another question, right? I will discuss that in a second, but first of all, let's look how she actually reconstructs the argument of Nick Bostrom. So here we have her argument. Let's listen how she reconstructs it.
If there are many civilizations that run many simulations of conscious beings, then you are likely to be simulated. First of all, it could be that one or both of the premises is wrong. Maybe there aren't any other civilizations, or they aren't interested in simulations.
Okay, but let's listen at the first premise of Nick Bostrom again, okay? So she says there are many civilizations, That's a different argument, right? So she doesn't reconstruct it, probably so that she has logic on her side. I'm a bit cynical here, right? Because I feel it's a bit unfair of how she argues, and then she doesn't even reconstruct the argument correctly, because her major argument is that there are no civilizations who reach that post-human stage where civilizations are run. I agree that Nick Bostrom's argument is a bit unclear for why there are many civilizations. So that is also a probability argument where we have to think it in the realm of possibilities. And that is not appropriately done, I believe, in the way he summarized the argument. But what I complain here about is that she doesn't take the logical consistency of the argument into account, and then she says she rejects the straw man, right? And that's unscientific. Well, I think we shouldn't accuse each other all the time of being unscientific. By the way, I believe that what is scientific is a huge discussion, right? It's not easily decided then when somebody does a mistake or in our eyes, a mistake that as a whole theory has to be immediately rejected, or that we should call it unscientific. I think Sabine Hossenfelder is always a bit straightforward, like a German says, well, that's obviously unscientific, also to all these scientific people. And that's maybe a bit too much for a fair discussion. I can see where that comes from. I mean, we have a lot of people who claim bullshit, right? And so in that sense, I can see where she comes from. But I think here it's a bit unfair for the participants involved in the discussion. So let's summarize her argument very briefly again. So she says, if we just show that something is the case, but we cannot show how, then that would be unscientific, because we also need an understanding of how something works. And if that is not given, we shouldn't do it. But see, I think that's not true for sciences necessarily. For example, I can imagine that in medicine, we figure out a way of how to heal people. We don't know how it works, but by a double-blind standard, which is kind of a scientific gold standard, we just see it works. We know that it works. We don't know how it works, right? And so we can have different assumptions about the possibilities or the spheres of possibilities of the universe, which can be meaningful to explore. Just to say, David Lewis invented a theory of possible worlds and applied it to logic and created modal logic. That's, by the way, not about multiple universes, right? But he says, well, these modal worlds, possible worlds, are real as they are part of our logical conception. And by that, he created an important contribution to logic, right? And that is not like necessarily an empirical study of the world where we figure out how the world works. We just show that it can be meaningful if we have certain assumptions. It can be logically meaningful. And so if I really wanted to argue hardcore against her, then I would focus on these issues. Nevertheless, on the overall core conception, I probably agree with her, because what's the point thinking about larger universes that include human beings that simulate us, if we are then just captured in the simulation and have to deal with our lives anyway? I never understood what it means that, let's say, a God outside has created us, if that kind of creation or the fact that we know that he has created us contributes something to our lives. And the same would be true for the simulation hypothesis. So I agree with her. I wouldn't go immediately the step and say, well, that's obviously pseudoscience. And I also disagree with how she deconstructed the argument. Now, therefore, let's come to what I find more interesting, because I think that the simulation hypothesis should not be entirely rejected for the reasons that she just suggested. And let's just come to the understanding of Baudrillard, because Baudrillard thinks that we do live in a simulation, but now the simulation is something that we see that is produced and we actively participate in that. And just to give an example, the simulation would be a metaverse. And we already do that because we we start dealing with digital currencies that have no relationship to reality necessarily anymore. They have a relationship to our internal reality that we take to be more seriously than it maybe should be taken. For example, we start currencies like Bitcoin or NFTs, and then we say, well, it's real in a sense, but it maybe has lost its connection to what really matters, if we can find that. I find that very interesting. Let me give you another example. When a YouTuber reacts to a reaction video of himself, how he reacted 3 years ago to another reaction video of another YouTuber, the question is that an internal self-referential cycle that was never about reality at all? Then we are in a simulation, and as Baudrillard would say, we are even in a simulacra. And his theory of simulacra has 4 stages that we want to look at very briefly. So we see here, and it's interesting that the internet provides the necessary memes for it. So we see here stage 1, we have a sign, we create signs that we also use in physics and in logics and so on. And initially, the signs reflect a basic reality. That is the idea. We don't reflect yet on logical laws or something and say reality is adequate to these logical laws. We shift this aside and we just say, okay, we reflect on reality, and well, this is obviously a pumpkin. And then, however, we change the reality. So the sign masks a basic reality. The image becomes a distortion of reality. So now here it is referred to a pumpkin pie. How do we have to understand that? Let's say I denote a chair and say these are chairs. And then we create a concept of chairs and we just start drawing chairs on a computer. Or let's better example, paper bins, right? And at some point I have a paper bin on my computer and I put paper from documents from my computer in there. So in a sense, it still has the function of a paper bin, right? But the relationship to reality is masked, and it's already here integrated in another kind of reality. And maybe we are already at stage 3, where the sign marks the absence of a basic reality. The image calls into question what the reality is and if it even exists. So here we have the Starbucks, pumpkin, whatever it is. And I assume that people who go every day to Starbucks and never have visited a countryside and don't go to supermarkets anymore to cook themselves, they may have forgotten the original idea of a pumpkin. And they may not know what a pumpkin is. That's how people, for example, don't know what guacamole is, that it comes from avocados. Right? So that's definitely possible. And then we reach another stage where we live in a sphere of signs that are just self-referential. And we may call this pumpkin, but there's nothing in there anymore that is related to pumpkin. Maybe there's still a flavor, but maybe even the flavor is something that is not pumpkin anymore, and we don't even know. So the sign bears no relation to any reality whatsoever anymore. It is its own simulacrum. And so this is what I find is an interesting theory, because we can say, yeah, you live in a simulation. If you start producing your profile on Instagram, it's not reality usually anymore. On Instagram, it seems we are all millionaires. A study recently done with respect to Instagram figured out that 90% of the population in the world must be millionaires. Jokes aside. So this is the interesting part of Baudrillard. And then he says, we have simulations of reality like Disneyland, and Disneyland is a simulation of a real world, but it actually distracts us from the fact that our life is already a simulation and largely infected by the productions of capitalism producing simulations. And then we have here a reflection on how our memes work with regard to these 4 stages. I don't completely understand it, but I assume the first meme still refers to reality. It's a basic reaction. Then the second one distorts and masks that kind of reality, connects it with other contents. And then at some point, these memes get their own life. And at the fourth point, we just use memes to refer to other memes to refer to other memes. And that can become a basic substance of our lives. Now, this is what I wanted to say in this video. If you're interested in this, I will actually have a further link to my other channel, which is called Assisted Reading. And that's where I actually read the book Simulacra and Simulation of Baudrillard, but also other books. You can zoom in, and then I really like, this is purely educational. There is no goal of making money with it or something. It's just where I want to have a discourse with other people on these books that in my mind are hard to understand. My point is not discussion and somebody come, that's unscientific, right? My point is to find more people who want to be surprised by the ways of how we can describe reality, maybe in a truth-worthy way, and finding people who help me to get interpretations more consistently. Not interested in debates. I'm interested in understanding the world through the framework of these philosophers, not necessarily through physics, and to understand these texts. So please join me on that channel if you're interested. For all the rest, I thank you that you listened till the end. Like, share and subscribe, participate more in the simulacrum, reference this video, how I reference about other references. Anyway, live long, do more pseudoscience, don't get distracted by the people who call you a pseudoscientist, accept you're a flat earther, and prosper.